life is no thrill. It's worse than nil. So draw to the right conclusion. Let them be still.
Welcome to episode number 77 of the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast, a podcast showcasing the wide range of perspectives and ideas throughout antinatalism as it exists today, through interviews with antinatalists and non-antinatalist thinkers and creators of all kinds. Now running 4 years strong, I'm your host, Amanda Sukenick, and today I'm speaking with the author of several fascinating papers on the subject of antinatalism, including Between Iron Skies and Copper Earth, Anti-natalism and the Death of God, Wailing from the Heights of Velleity, a strong case for antinatalism in these trying times, a sonogram of the dark side of the Tao, the possibility of antinatalism in Daoism, amongst others. Robbert Zandbergen. Robbert, welcome to the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast. I've been reading your work on the subject of antinatalism for quite some time now. You really have been fairly prolific on the subject, having produced at least 6 academic papers on antinatalism over the last few years. Robbert, I want to say first off that your papers, this might be a small point, but it's worth mentioning, I think. Your papers have some of the best titles I've ever read in my life. And even where I disagree with you sometimes within the body of your work, there's an undeniable poetry to your writing that makes it a pleasure to read every time. If we can start out with just the most basic of questions, may I ask, who is Robbert Zandbergen?
Well, thank you very much, Amanda, for having me today, first and foremost. Good to talk to you. I've been a big fan of your podcast as well these past couple of years. So it's thank you for having me on today. As to my introduction, my name is Robbert. I'm a philosopher. I specialize in Eastern and Western philosophies. The last couple of years, maybe a bit more the Western side of things, in particular, the ancient Greek and Roman philosophies. But of course, I'm very busy with anti-natalism too. So I just, study a lot of things I'm interested in. So that's me in a nutshell.
Wonderful. Robbert, why are you or are you not an antinatalist?
So I would probably describe myself as a non-practicing antinatalist. I agree with the truth of some of the antinatalist conclusions, but I don't want to put them into practice myself. So granted, everything that's being said is very good, but I don't want to commit myself to to not having kids. I do want to have kids eventually. So that's pretty much a deal breaker, isn't it? If you have kids, you can't really be an antinatalist. Although I think now you could also, we could broaden the scope of the categories a bit. Maybe you could be an antinatalist with kids, but it's going to be a bit tough. It's like being afraid of spiders, having 8 legs yourself, or something like this. Living in a skyscraper, being afraid of heights. It just sounds a bit hypocritical, a bit conflicting. But perhaps I would just leave it at this and call myself a non-practicing antinatalist.
Fair enough. Well, there are certainly antinatalists with children. There's quite a number of antinatalists that had children before becoming antinatalists. I can't say I know of too many that have had children after learning about antinatalism, but there are some that have adopted. Of course. So there's certainly a lot of variation to this thing, and there's certainly a lot of ways that people are existing as antinatalists. So I actually haven't heard too many people describe it in such a way as a non-practicing antinatalist, but I find that really interesting. And this has clearly been a subject that has been of great interest to your work. I mean, how did you become interested in the subject? When did you first learn about it? And why do you feel that it's such an important idea? I mean, it's truly, it seems like it's something that's really inspired you, and I'd love to hear more about that. Yeah.
No, absolutely. So I think I took the traditional road to antinatalism. It was Schopenhauer. I started reading Schopenhauer at an early age. I didn't quite get it, but I kept coming back to Schopenhauer. And then there's clearly a lot of antinatalism before antinatalism existed in Schopenhauer's work. I feel that this is underlighted in the antinatalist community. For instance, Professor Benatar, he refers to Schopenhauer a number of times, but there's not a clear sort of sense of indebtedness or paying lip service to Schopenhauer. But you do see a lot of the stuff that you see in later antinatalist texts in his work as well. So this got me interested. And just randomly came across antinatalism maybe in 2015. So read all the classic works, the articles, the books, and thought it was pretty impressive. And yeah. So yeah, like I said, like the orthodox route, Schopenhauer brought me to the arms of antinatalism. And I guess for most people now, it's more like societal things, civilizational things, cultural things, discontent, concern with the environment. I think that's what pushes most people towards antinatalism. For me, it was purely philosophical, I would say.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I sort of have to agree with you. I think that, you know, are the number of people identifying as antinatalists now is massive compared to when I first started in 2010. You know, if you look at the subreddit, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I think it is unfortunately a bit of a minority of people who are attracted to the philosophical literature, to the history of it. It does, you know, there are all of these different groups that have kind of co-opted their place within antinatalism, like anti-work and all of these different things that sort of bring people to an antinatalist perspective. That is really interesting. But it's good that you started with the classics, so wonderful. Outside of antinatalism, what are your other areas of philosophical and academic interest?
Right. So at the moment, I'm mostly doing Hellenistic philosophy. So that's basically philosophy from about 300 BC. So Stoicism, Epicureanism, these are big topics. There's going to be Aristotle, Plato. I used to be pretty big into what would be called existentialism, but it's a bit of a lame label, right? What is existentialism? But you know, Nietzsche and Sartre, those are people I like to study as well. Freud has been a constant companion for the past 15 years or so, and then of course Nietzsche, Schopenhauer. So I would say Schopenhauer is definitely like number one. Nietzsche and Freud probably number 2 and 3 then. So that, in addition to the antinatalism stuff, is mostly what I'm doing. So it's either good or it's pretty sad, but that's just what I like to do.
No, I don't think it's sad at all. I think it's wonderful. And then in addition to that, you also study Eastern philosophy quite.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So mostly Daoism. But I've done my fair share of Confucianism and Buddhism. But Daoism is really what I'm mostly interested in that part of the world. So
excellent. And we'll talk a little bit more about your research into that in just a little while. What amazing.
Sure.
Amazing. Yeah, so you cover a great deal of ground. That's really wonderful. You certainly accomplished it. So now I'd love to speak to you in some depth about your papers. I wanted to say real quick to our audience, we could easily spend an entire 2 hours just talking about only one of these papers. They're very densely packed with all kinds of great material worthy of being discussed in detail. For the sake of time, I have essentially chosen only a few questions per paper. Robbert, I hope that this has been a wise choice in attempting to present a bit of an overview of your work on the subject. But we'll do our best to cover as much ground as possible. And I, of course, highly encourage people to follow the links below where they can find each of the papers so that they can read them for themselves. Your first paper on the subject of antinatalism was called Between Iron Skies and Copper Earth, Antinatalism and the Death of God. If you don't mind, I'd love to read the abstract. Is that all right?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Abstract. The proclamation of the death of God came at a pivotal time in the history of humankind. It far transcended the concerns of the religious faithful and dented the entire fabric of human existence. Left to its own devices, humans intended their consciousness to replace God's. This proved to be a terrible mistake that collapsed the entire modern project. One of the worldviews that emerged in the wake of this eruption was anti-natalism, which refers to the conviction that human reproduction should be brought to an absolute halt. This is the most modern outgrowth of the death of God and represents the most radical face of secular humanism. In spite of the admittedly dark fumes that leak out of the term anti-natalism, this philosophical position emerges quite naturally when we consider the depletion of our traditional sources of philosophical inquiry.
So that's the abstract, and I have quite a few specific questions that I want to get to in a bit. But can you just tell me a little bit, I'm just really curious how this specific paper came to be, and maybe a little bit about, its reception.
Right. So first of all, I'd say you weren't lying about my papers being dense, because that sounded pretty dense. I'd never heard this read out to me like this before. But yeah, it is, right? That was my first paper. So I had been reading antinatalism for a number of years. I'd come across a few people that are really diving into the history of the movement. I'm sure you know these works as well, but there's a lot of people who find antinatalism in ancient Buddhism, in Brahmanism, in Greek literature, in Sophocles, and these guys. This never satisfied me, like this hunt for antinatalist utterances in sort of random words. So I wanted to really see where this movement came from. and not just look at specific instances of citations that came across as anti-natalist. And then I started thinking about this death of God motive and hypermodernity and this kind of thing. So that's where I localized it in sort of this 19th century secularization drive, if we can call it that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yes, certainly. There's a lot of there's sort of a dividing line that like antinatalist historians like Curry McKerma make between contemporary antinatalism and proto-antinatalism. And I know that you reference who's his name, Aaron Metz or something, or he wrote the novel The Problem of New Life. He makes that distinction too, that like, just because people sort of say antinatally things in the past doesn't really mean that it's a one-to-one comparison with contemporary antinatalism. And that is an important point to make, certainly. So I really, there was a lot that was familiar to me in this paper, because the form of the iteration of antinatalism that I was first exposed to was very heavily and concretely atheistic, like antinatalism was the last stop on there is no God train, which is sort of a different side of the same coin, I think, to maybe what you're saying. The difference is that I sort of see that as a great thing, not, mind you, because it's a part of some rosy interpretation of reality. Far from it. I think it's great that the world grows more liberated from the idea of God, because I don't think humanity can solve real problems under, totally false assumptions about reality. And that ideas like antinatalism and extinction, animal rights are really like excellent tools in the pursuit of human beings finally doing this existence thing, maybe the right way. So I'm curious about what your thoughts on that are. But also, I mean, if God had not died, why would we be living in a better world? Because I think that's part of sort of what you're saying in the paper, is that once God died, or once we moved away from the concept of God, then there was all this failure, and antinatalism is maybe part of that failure. Yeah.
Right. So first of all, for full disclosure, I don't think God has died, but clearly there was a big thing in the 19th century and beyond. So I think certain things had to happen in order for something like antinatalism to rise. I don't think antinatalism could have emerged at any earlier time in history. So it could not even have emerged in the late 19th century. Like it had to happen now, like late 20th century. That's when it started becoming a thing. And many things had to happen. So many of the darker things associated with modernity had to progress in order for this to be able to rise up. So that's why I also think it's interesting. And one of the main things that fascinates me about antinatalism now is not so much the philosophical sort of weight of the ideas, but the place that it has in culture, the relation it has to certain civilizational processes, sort of the bigger picture. When you look down from this ivory tower and you see antinatalism walking around in the marketplace below, that's what fascinates me most, especially how it relates to all these processes like the so-called death of God, modernity, secularization. I think the place of antinatalism is fairly interesting in this bigger scheme of things.
Picking up on one thing that you said, that antinatalism perhaps couldn't have emerged, until really quite recently. Yes, you do say in the essay, it is inconceivable that a conviction like this could have emerged in an atmosphere defined by the presence of God. But in fact, a good deal of anti-procreative thinking existed when God was quite alive and well. There have been, though we could not call them antinatalists as we know antinatalists to exist today, the Ankratites, the Manichaeans, the Bogomils, the Cathars, arguably, if they existed, and other Gnostic Christian sects, had some very antinatalist thinking going on in their Christianity. Even coupled with perhaps not veganism, but vegetarianism, which is, pretty similar to what you find in antinatalism today. So considering that, how do you account for that level of antinatalism existing in history?
Right. So for me, there can be sort of parallels with the antinatalist movement, but you're only an antinatalist if you live nowadays and you've read the necessary books. Only if you're part of this sort of unofficial international community of antinatalists are you an antinatalist. So you need to be carrying your card at all times, pretty much. But I I'm fascinated by all these attempts to look for antinatalism, say, in a text from 2,000 years ago. I don't think that's necessarily a very productive undertaking, to be honest. Like, you can find antinatalist utterances in poetry from different traditions. It doesn't make it antinatalist. I think antinatalism is a very clear development over the past 2,000 years. And we have a very clear product now that is antinatalist. So not everything else can be grouped together with this antinatalism, I think.
What do you think of as sort of the dividing line? Would you just say,
Right.
would you say that it's asymmetry? Would you say that it's the presence of concern for extinctionism? I mean, what are the clear defining marks between proto-antinatalism and what we call antinatalism today then?
So I think there's three elements that all need to be present. So first of all, there's the diagnosis that life is all about suffering. Then there's the solution that if we don't exist anymore, if we're extinct, we're not going to have these problems anymore. And then there's the very practical avenue towards that, which is refraining from giving birth to children, right? So if you have these three elements, that makes you an antinatalist these days. So we can find these elements in earlier philosophical works and literature, but they're never present all at the same time. Schopenhauer comes very close, but still, we really see this developing in the work of David Benatar. And I don't know if you have many people who would disagree with that here, but that's how I think about it. That's how I view the antinatalist movement these days. So these three elements under the umbrella of calling yourself an antinatalist or viewing yourself as a part of the antinatalist movement.
Yeah, I think I definitely see what you're saying. I mean, what would be your assessment of something like the wisdom of Silenus? Because that definitely, there is not only a recommendation that it'd be better to not exist, but there also is a sort of a pro-mortalist recommendation too, that it would be better to exist, not exist right now. So do you think that would be a fairly antinatalist statement, compared to contemporary antinatalism, or no?
Right. So Silenus is someone I write about. I think I'm very fascinated by Silenus, of course. I think many antinatalists are, because it sounds very antinatalist, right? This idea that it would have been better if we weren't here is something you read in Benatar's 2006 work. Like, it's just basically an elaboration of that theme. So I used to be tempted to view something like the wisdom of Silenus as antinatalist, but I think we have to be strict and we have to keep the gate closed for these earlier texts. So nowadays I'm more strict. I don't view it as antinatalism, but there's many instances that kind of make me doubt. Another one is Hegesias. Do you know this guy? Right. So a hedonist, but probably one of the most pessimistic hedonists. He literally persuaded people to kill themselves, and his books were banned. He was fired from his teaching in Alexandria. A recent historian joked that this is the first instance of an academic who had his or her freedom curtailed by the government. Probably not going to be the last one either. But he literally convinced his students to kill themselves because happiness, well-being, fortune, these things are inaccessible in life, and life is all about suffering. So that's why we have to kill each other, or ourselves. Sorry about that. It is sort of antinatalist, but again, we cannot allow these people to sort of enter the antinatalist movement nowadays. So I would keep them all outside of the house. But there's interesting parallels between their work, their sayings, and what we now call antinatalism. So there's definitely some clues, but I think we have to be strict and just enforce a no entry policy for anyone before, let's say, 1995 or so.
I don't want to harp on this point too much, but I really do legitimately find that really fascinating. I guess I am a bit more permissive as to allowing a lot of the proto-antinatalism to have some place in the antinatal world now. I mean, chiefly because I don't think that what antinatalism is currently is particularly solid. I mean, the formulation of certain iterations of antinatalism are quite solid, coming from specific philosophers. Like, I'm not in no way making the claim that David Benatar's antinatalism is not solid as far as the work that he's created, but the identity of antinatalists is so all over the place, and the differences in
what antinatalists believe, even in contemporary times, is so all over the place that it seems a little a bit of a mistake to not allow some of these older utterances, because it was sort of as far as the past would allow people to go. I mean, I think there is a maybe a bit of a truth in the fact that you just couldn't speak these ideas in a more
right.
detailed form, in the past. But anyway, I mean, I really appreciate your thoughts on that. I mean, you do. I don't remember in which paper, but you do speak a little bit about defining antinatalism.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure which paper that was in, but I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how you define antinatalism, because as you likely know, there is no standard English dictionary definition of the term yet. It actually at this point only appears in 2 French dictionaries online.
Right.
And that's
yeah,
it.
Yeah.
So how would you define antinatalism? Yeah.
I would disconnect antinatalism from reproduction. I think what's the core of antinatalism is the diagnosis that life is terrible, that life was not supposed to happen, that life cannot be good. We can try all sorts of things. We can be religious. We can become transhumanist. But life is not getting any better. The definition of our lives is just that it's horrible. We suffer emotionally, spiritually, physically. There's no way out of this except for extinction, of course, but that's a bit of a tough act to follow. So yeah, for me, it's really about the pessimism that human life is not that great. It can never be great, in fact. And it's, it demands pretty serious reflection. And then an outgrowth of this, or a consequence of this, or follow-up, we can even say, is when we bring reproduction into this. And we say, okay, a very practical way to deal with this problem, to rectify the situation, is by just not having kids. So many people focus on the reproduction part, but I think that's only a secondary part. The starting shot of antinatalism is really this grim observation that life is horrible. And then, of course, you can ask yourself, is that just conscious life? Is that human life? Is it all life? For me, it's just conscious human life. And then, yeah, one of the solutions to this problem is putting a cap on reproduction, or banning it outright, or just persuading people gently, to not reproduce because of the moral dilemmas. But for me, the diagnosis is one, and then the second chapter is this sort of road towards that, and that's what I find innovative. Because people have been lamenting about how difficult human life is for millennia, but this is the first real sort of solution that's offered, and I think that's quite genius. That you tie this to our slow extinction, and I guess there's also a lot of people who wish to not focus on the extinction part, the suffering part, the diagnosis part. They focus just on reproduction. I have a few thoughts about those people active in antinatalism. I just disagree with them.
I disagree with them too, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, maybe I'm a little bit too strict when it comes to this. Maybe it's because I'm, non-practicing antinatalist. I don't know why, but we have to separate. We have to clearly give our boundaries when it comes to defining antinatalism, because it's like you said before. We're still in this ongoing process of defining what exactly it is. So that's why I think it's important to have clear definitions. Diagnosis, life is all about suffering. There is a way out. It's our own extinction. And so that's that would be my most basic definition of this. Just out of curiosity, how would you define it? What would be your clearest?
I mean, I think the most basic. Well, first of all, let me just say, I think the idea of separating reproduction from antinatalism is, I don't know if I've ever heard anybody quite articulate it like that. I don't know that I agree. I mean, because I think that it's not only a diagnosis that life has all of these negatives, but it firmly rests on the idea that to impose it is unethical.
Right.
So therefore, I think that the reproduction angle is incredibly intrinsic to the diagnosis of it being all this negative. I don't think that we can separate the extinctionism at all, and it often confuses and frustrates me a lot that the antinatalist community typically does that. I mean, you typically find a sort of, if not an anti-extinction sentiment in antinatalism, it just sort of sweeps it under the rug. And so what are we really talking about here? We're talking about a sort of a quasi-pronatalism then. I mean, at what point does an antinatalist start saying, an antinatalist of that kind anyway, start saying that, yeah, we should probably reproduce children at some point? I don't know. And you never really get a clear answer to that question.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's just always been particularly clear to me that extinction is the mantra in the antinatalist community that you often find is that extinction is the consequence and not the goal. And that just never really made any sense to me. I mean, I don't, especially when it comes to antinatalist activism, if you're advocating something that you know in the long term is going to cause extinction, then I just don't know how that parses. You know, at what point do you stop advocating for it then? At what point are you, so do you have any thoughts on that before we go on? But yeah, I definitely do agree with your sentiments on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. I keep telling everybody it's all about extinction. I think people are scared of it because extinction of the human species is, you can't formulate anything that's more grim, more sort of extreme, more radical than this, right? People used to plead for, removing suffering any other way, but now you want to eradicate the entire human species. There's no coming back from this. So it's one of the most radical things, the most radical thing I would say you can offer the world.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think a lot of this is fear. There's an incredible amount of fear in the antinatalist community, and I think that's the explanation, really. I mean, continuing from that. I mean, I get a sense sometimes reading your papers, and perhaps I'm just picking up on something that's not there at all, but I mean, do you see antinatalism as sort of like a tragic and perhaps dangerous idea? Is that part of the sentiment that you feel that you're communicating?
Well, technically, I don't think it's pessimistic or tragic at all. I think if you look at the work of David Benatar, for instance, for him, it's salvific, it's hopeful, right? He wants to eradicate suffering. The only way we can do this, and we've tried stuff for thousands of years, it never works. We keep getting back to the same point where we suffer. The only way to conclusively fix this problem is by making us extinct. So I think there's definitely a hopeful component there, even though we're talking about the grimmest subject of all time. I think it's tragic only in the sense that many antinatalists agree that it's going to be very tough to convince people gently to give up reproduction. And that's the definition of tragedy. Something bad happens, but you cannot do anything about this. So I would say ultimately antinatalism responds to the tragedy of modernity. We have all these problems that we cannot fix, but in itself, it's salvific. It's meant to be a medicine for our ills. It's meant to rectify the great wrong of our existence. So it has an interesting relationship with tragedy, but I don't think it's that tragic, even though it deals with very specifically tragic topics like the extinction of the human species.
Brilliantly said. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to point out one really excellent line. Antinatalists will be asked about suicide as often as a comedian will be asked to tell a joke.
Yeah.
Truer words were never spoken. Boy, howdy, is that ever right?
Good to pick this up.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I'm. That's just absolutely fantastic. You don't really get into this much in this particular essay, but in several of them, you do defend that antinatalism is not pro-mortalist, and I was curious to hear more of your thoughts on the antinatalism pro-mortalism connection, because this is becoming one of the most prevalent disagreements within the community. There's many antinatalists now who identify as pro-mortalists as well as antinatalists. And I just find that fascinating. So yes, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think technically, if you want to be consistent and you identify as an antinatalist, I think much can be said about the pro-mortalism that you must adopt. Because, for instance, Professor Benatar, he admits that nobody's going to find this very persuasive. The majority of people are not going to find this persuasive ever. So, given this, it's bound to fail, right? As long as let's say 95% of all people are going to keep reproducing blindly, I would say. So pro-mortalism would be good to achieve this goal of having no suffering, which also implies, us being dead. But of course, you can't accuse anti-natalists. Like I'm not a pro-mortalist. I don't want to persuade people to kill themselves. I don't think it would be good. It would make anti-natalism a lot more successful if there was some degree of force, right? If you could forcefully sterilize people, yeah, we could easily achieve the goals of not having suffering anymore. But of course, as Benatar also points out, it's going to lead to a whole lot of problems that are going to be very difficult to solve. So I'm a little bit annoyed by people who assume an anti-natalist must be pro-mortalist, but at the same time, there's some truth to this, right? If you are pleading for the extinction of the human species, it's going to be tough to be nice about this. You can't really be a nice guy when you're preaching extinction, I would say.
Well, I don't know about that. I think you can kindly preach extinction, but I should have asked this. I should have asked this before this. I mean, how exactly are you defining pro-mortalism? Because it's interesting that it does. Pro-mortalism seems to cover a lot of ground. I mean, David Benatar sort of implies that it means a killing extinction is what he calls it. But then other people sort of mean it in conjunction with the right to die. It can also sort of have relations to abortion. It can also sort of have a relation to like negative utilitarian red button solutions. So, I mean, how would you define pro-mortalism? Yeah.
I think when you sort of vouch for unnatural death, right, suicide, killing, as a means to reach your, in this case, philosophical goals. So when you say we must be extinct because we must get rid of suffering and therefore we must all die ASAP. So either we force sterilizations on people or we just start randomly killing people. So this killing extinction that Benatar talks about, that would be pro-mortalism.
Okay, excellent. Yes, and
so the most efficient sort of path or the fastest way to extinction would undoubtedly be pro-mortalist.
I see what you're saying. Okay, excellent. Yes, yes, and killing extinction is not what we're going for. I mean, I have, if the red button were real, I would think that it would be the most ethical solution to press it. But obviously, what I'm invested in is the convincing game, is the argument game. And that's the way I would like to see anti-natalism achieve its goals.
Can I ask one thing? Have you ever had anyone on the show who was a pro-mortalist who was really preaching like, okay, we got to just get rid of us as soon as possible?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Who was like the most radical, you'd say?
Well,
you can tell me afterwards too if you don't want to say it on air.
No, I mean, so I the form of antinatalism that I first found was on YouTube, and it's called Effelism. And so Effelism is sort of a strict form of negative utilitarianism. Yeah, it's not to say that it advocates going out and killing people. But yes, it does advocate for, like, again, it's like a form of negative utilitarianism. So it advocates. I don't think it has much difference, honestly, with Benatar's recommendation for phased extinction. And I just sort of, let me put it this way. I have sort of am of the opinion that any future path that humans will take, like if we go down a transhumanist path, I personally don't think that that's going to be one without harm. I really don't. I think, if we go down an anti-natalist path, I also don't think that that's going to be one without harm. So I think that there is, I just think it comes with whatever future we go down. But yes, I mean, that is probably the most aggressive form of antinatalism. But I mean, but the pro-mortalism that most people that have come on the show espouse has more to do with killing yourself,
right? Yeah.
Than extinction solutions. So
I mean, it would be good for the environment if people killed themselves. That's grim but true, I would say. But yeah, that's fair enough. But so I understand the sort of the implication of pro-mortalism. It doesn't have to be true, of course. Like, you can be a non-practicing anti-natalist and not preach extinction, but recognize that, of course, it would be the best solution.
Right.
But the funny thing about this is also, this is what I I mean, David Benatar is one of my idols, right? And I don't want to talk about him for 2 hours, but I do criticize him in my work, and I do think you can take a shot at your idols every now and then, right?
Yeah, of course.
Keeps you on your toes.
Yes.
So one of the things I disagree with is that when we are extinct, not only are we not going to suffer, but we're not going to have anything. We're not going to have toothaches. We're not going to stub our toes on a table. All these things are going to be gone. So it's a bit of a lazy solution, I guess. Like we're also not going to have computer viruses when we're gone. We're not going to have, I don't know, broken glasses or all these trivial things that are a part of life, and that's nobody really views as a significant harm to them. I spilled some coffee. Yeah, I'm never going to spill coffee if I'm dead, of course. So it's just it's a bit of a lazy solution, because in addition to suffering, all other forms of things that happen to us are also going to be gone. So of course there's not going to be suffering. We're not going to be around. So it's I don't know.
Well, no, I think that's an excellent point. I've said many times, I think that part of being an extinctionist is living your life with a sense of mourning. Because being an extinctionist doesn't necessarily mean that you hate every aspect of life, or that you think all experiences are bad, or that there's lots of wonderful things in life. I mean, I thoroughly enjoy them, but I also happen to be an extinctionist. And so it is sort of you take with you psychologically an aspect of saying goodbye to everything, when you're espousing this idea. So I don't know about it being a lazy solution necessarily, but I do think that aspect of mourning actually in some respects does sort of, I mean, I can only speak from my own experiences, but it does sort of allow you to savor your own life in a little bit, because those little things, the way light hits the ground or something, I mean, that's nobody's going to be there to experience it if we're all gone. So, but I'm here to experience it now. And so there is a pause that it allows you, that I think not being an extinctionist maybe doesn't. So there's different ways of looking at that for sure. I'd love to read your conclusion to this paper, if you don't mind. Is that
sure,
okay?
Of course, go
all
for
right.
it. Yeah.
In spite of its aims, antinatalism occupies a corner in the shadow of the value crisis that emerged in the wake of the death of God. As such, it operates in the same value vacuum that has animated intellectuals for the past 150 years or so. Antinatalism cannot, however, impose its claims as if were not thus confined, as but one of the more voracious mourners in the funeral procession of God. In other words, antinatalism launches claims against a foe vulnerable only to meta-claims. These mere claims, consequently, only ricochet right back into its face. The radicalism of this modern phenomenon can only pick up as much momentum as a muscle car on a racetrack, and in the end, it will not get anywhere real. Viewed as such, its radicalism becomes the taunt of trolls, measured in bytes or decibels, but never measured for its actual success. For whatever we do with the chapels of old, no matter how we decide to use them in the 21st century, it is evident that the eyes of God nictitate behind the stained glass of human efflorescence.
So, Robert, why so pessimistic? You don't think antinatalism will succeed? I'm just joking. But I'm really curious to hear more about that, the radicalism coming back into its face. But I want to hear more about how far you believe antinatalism could go, why you think it'll fail. I don't necessarily disagree with you, but I'm interested in hearing more of your thoughts on that. Yeah.
Well, so when you tie antinatalism to extinction, first and foremost, you know that this is never going to happen because too many people are not going to want extinction for our species. So I think you can only say antinatalism works when you have a local, sort of very specific goal. Suppose you want to bring down the average temperature by 0.5 degrees, right? And then you make an agreement with everybody in the world, say, okay, nobody's going to have kids the coming 10 years. That's, of course, going to lead to all sorts of long-term societal, civilizational problems. But if you just have like a 10-year pause, I'm sure we can fix many things in the meantime. We can reorganize our resources and do all sorts of great things. But that, for me, is not real antinatalism. Antinatalism is only real when it's conclusive and when it aspires to this extinction. And that's necessarily going to fail. So coming back also to your question about tragedy, I think that's pretty tragic. Like, we have a very clear-cut solution that's 100% going to work, but it's never going to be possible to actually implement this in society. And that's, I think, where society and philosophy clash. And I think in that sort of meeting, I am most interested in.
Yes, yeah, that's a great interest to me as well. So how in your opinion, how far can antinatalism go? Like what will be the stopping point?
I don't know. I think it's already clashing quite significantly with transhumanism, which I view in many respects as its counterpart, where transhumanism is, I don't know, fairly pessimistic. Antinatalism is fairly pessimistic, and then transhumanism wants to keep on going at any cost. So I think that's definitely more hopeful. I'm not sure where antinatalism can take us, to be honest. It could only lead to a bunch of people committing themselves to non-reproduction, non-procreation, but it's never going to really reach its goals unless you sort of water down the content, the message of antinatalism, and you acknowledge that, yes, we can have various forms of antinatalism. We don't all have to be radical and reach for extinction, but we can also just decide on an individual level that we're not going to have kids and not reproduce. When you think that those sort of different degrees of antinatalism can coexist, then antinatalism can be successful. It could reach the lives of tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people. But other than this, I don't think it's going to really reach its end, of course. So I think it's very interesting that the place that it occupies now that fascinates me, not its efficiency, I would say. So the fact that we have antinatalism is impressive, not the fact that it's very efficient or it's going to persuade everybody. I think it's a very powerful idea.
Forgive me, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's so good.
Listen, as much as I want to see antinatalism succeed, and maybe I am a bit more hopeful for its prospects than you are, I mean, I can't deny that even now it doesn't seem to be having any impact on birth rates. I mean, antinatalism is not at a point, if it ever will be, where it's having those discernible that's kind of discernible impact. And I don't know what it would take to get it to that point. But yeah, thank you for your thoughts on that. I really appreciate that very much. So thank you so much, Robbert. Now, moving on to your second paper, I'd love to read the abstract. The title is Wailing from the Heights of Velleity, a strong case for antinatalism in these trying times. This was written in 2021.
Abstract. The 21st century is teeming with larger-than-life threats to our larger-than-life existence. Famine, war, natural disasters, and climate change, viruses, incurable diseases, etc. At stake is the future of the human species as a whole. But it is not just external threats that herald in the prospective end of humanity. We also face the general exhaustion of many of our earlier and more comfortable modes of philosophy. This is arguably a much graver threat. It is this gloomy atmosphere that the philosophy of antinatalism taps into. Antinatalism is the philosophical view according to which human reproduction should be brought to a halt for any of a variety of reasons. It will be argued here, however, that we can only come to the antinatalist conclusion when we affirm that humankind somehow represents a very persistent anomaly in the universe at large. Otherwise, we could simply resort to much less radical steps than the ones advocated by antinatalism. Based on this, an important distinction will be made between the reactionary or activist antinatalism and its more philosophical, so-called originary counterpart. Ultimately, against recent attempts that push for a moderate embrace of antinatalism, the present work makes a strong case for it. It is argued that this is warranted by the very writings most usually associated with this radical philosophical position.
Excellent. So one more quote, and then I promise.
No, of course.
It will. I want to say first off. This paper is of particular interest to me because I do identify as an antinatalist activist, and so some of the distinctions that you make are really quite fascinating. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you about them. It will be argued here that these claims can only be warranted by the underlying thought that humankind should never have come into existence in the first place. We can only come to the antinatalist conclusion when we affirm that humankind somehow represents a very persistent anomaly in the universe at large. So some antinatalists might say that. I don't necessarily not say that. I think we are a mistake of aberrant, chemistry. But I would argue that that's a bit of a narrow view of antinatalism, in my opinion, because as I believe but that I don't necessarily see addressed in a lot of your papers is that a great deal of antinatalism is not simply anthropocentric, it's sentiocentric. So it's not simply the idea that human life is a mistake, it's sentience in life more broadly. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, even David Benatar, does, it's the jury is a little bit still out whether he would consider himself a sentiocentric antinatalist, but he does mention, that animal life is included in his assessment. So
yeah, this is what I find fascinating about Benatar, because at certain points he definitely hints at some sort of animal antinatalism, and a lot of stuff has been written about this these days as well. It's a fascinating problem. For Benatar, key to his project is that we as human beings are able to sort of choose this solution of extinction. Now, animals cannot do this. So animal antinatalism on his own terms would be impossible because we need consent, right? He's clearly against killing extinction. He's in favor of dying extinction, phased extinction. We need to sort of get used to the idea that reproduction is horrible, too many moral problems associated with it. We're going to keep perpetuating or enlarging this circle of suffering around us. Animals cannot make these decisions, so they can never consent to their own extinction, unless you believe in like this lemming mythology, these creatures that would leap from a cliff or something. Most animals are not able to come up with these things. So I think on his own terms, animal antinatalism cannot exist. So for me, I'm a non-practicing philosophical anthropocentric antinatalist, I would say.
Fair enough. And I am most definitely a sentiocentric antinatalist. I mean, incidentally, this is why Ethylism started, because it didn't. Yep. The feeling was that Benatarianism and the way the contemporary antinatalism was going did not account enough for the animals. So I'm not a killing extinctionist based on for human life, but I do think that, especially considering our own end, we have a responsibility to the animals to intervene. And that's just my belief. Obviously, it's not everybody shares it, but yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
So, you agree with this distinction between dying extinction and killing extinction? But do you think that animals could ever opt for a dying extinction, or it could only be killing? Is that what you said? Or
yes, I think that we would have to decide for them. That is awful and paternalistic as it is. Some sort of decision should be made in their place.
Wouldn't that be what do they call it? Speciesism?
I don't believe so. I mean, I'm sure that it is called speciesism, but I mean, I cannot justify leaving them behind. I mean, that is the distinction between. I'm sure you're also familiar with vehement voluntary human extinction movement. Mm-hmm. They're sort of an older form of antinatalist activism. But I mean, their recommendation is that we go extinct and they, human life or animal life or other life will be sort of marvelous without us. Mm-hmm. And I don't believe that that's
right. So you don't think animals can flourish in the absence of humans at all?
I think they will replicate to a degree that that has not existed since we were around. They will kill and eat each other infinitum, and then they will perish in natural extinction. And I think that human beings are the one creature on Earth that could somehow. I don't pretend to think that we have the solution now. I think it would take a tremendous effort for humans to engineer a solution for the animals in some sort of ethical way. But yeah, I mean, I don't believe that nature is suffering free. I think it's filled with suffering that shouldn't be allowed to exist past us. If we could do something about it.
That's a fair point. I get that. I disagree, but it is a fair point. I must give you this. Yeah.
More than fair. So, Robert, most interesting to me, you speak quite a bit about the subject of antinatalist activism. Another quote, I apologize. While a quick internet search will yield a plethora of news articles and other results dealing with antinatalism, we need to make an important distinction between so-called reactionary or activist antinatalism and its more philosophical counterpart. The former is becoming increasingly visible and audible as a stopgap solution to some of the biggest problems of our age, With a total disregard for its philosophical implications, many activists that claim to subscribe to antinatalism turn to social media to pledge their allegiance to it. And again, sorry, one more long quote and then we're off to the races. This brings us to the heart of the activism philosophy or reactionary originary divide hinted at above. While there are a few instances of true philosophical antinatalism, as we will see below, we are witnessing an explosive growth in online activist antinatalism that is mostly concerned with finding stopgap solutions to today's most pressing problems. This type of antinatalism can be called reactionary, in that is simply response to current affairs, and from there draws a conclusion regarding childbirth and maintains that life has become unbearable, rife with suffering, especially in the 21st century, and that childbirth is, for the moment at least, not permissible or desirable. When large-scale problems like climate change and overpopulation are solved, we may as well start the lines of reproduction again. This type of antinatalist activism is, as of yet, mostly founded in constellations of loosely associated individuals on the internet. While their understanding of the philosophical sides of things may be lacking, their rise nonetheless indicates that traditional values concerning reproduction and childbirth are being openly criticized and even rejected. While this is happening mostly in online circles, it paves the way for deepening of antinatalist philosophy as well. You speak a lot about how the differences in the world of antinatalist activism and antinatalist philosophy are. You speak a lot about those differences, and I actually don't disagree with you particularly there. I think antinatalism as a movement attracts people for all kinds of reasons, and often none of those reasons have anything to do with philosophy. In 2017, there was a researcher named Natalia Santi, not a real name, I don't think, who conducted a survey on antinatalists within various online communities during that time, particularly on Reddit and Facebook. And one of the questions in the survey asked ANs how many books on antinatalism they had read, and a shocking 65.1% of all antinatalists surveyed had never read a book on antinatalism.
Right.
So I agree, there's a huge issue there. And by the way, I like that you referenced George Rasaleto's paper to strengthen this point. George has been a guest on the show. He's great.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
So I don't think that you're mistaken in diagnosing some of the antinatalism that you see on places like Reddit as reactionary or less authentic to philosophical antinatalism. I'd love to hear just more about that. But my only contention is I think that few would seriously call a lot of what you're seeing in those places as antinatalist activism. In fact, I think a lot of those people would reject the term calling that antinatalist activism. In fact, activism is kind of a dirty word in antinatalist
Yeah, I know.
It's which I find fascinating.
It was all intentional.
There you go. Okay. I'm curious as to your familiarity with quote unquote real antinatalist activist groups such as Child Free India, Anti-natalism Japan, Anti-natalism International, Stop Having Kids, and most recently Antinatalist Activism. What do you think about these more focused antinatalist initiatives?
Well, I can't speak on all of these groups that you mentioned, but I think in general these movements are not really anti-natalist. I think when you localize, when you argue that reproduction should be stopped for, say, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, in certain locations, at certain times, whatever, I don't think that that's real anti-natalism. Likewise, suppose I love to party. I want to party every day of the week. I want to drink. I want to get drunk. I don't want to have kids. And would I then be an anti-natalist if I say, no, I prefer to party and drink? I don't, of course, but suppose I would be like that. I don't want to have kids ever because I just want to party. Would I be an anti-natalist? I would say no. But technically, if you look at the very meaning of the word anti-natalism, you're against birth. You don't want to reproduce for any of a variety of reasons. So you would technically be an anti-natalist according to many people that call themselves anti-natalists. Likewise, if I have some sort of terrible accident this afternoon, I'm not physically able to reproduce anymore, would I be an anti-natalist? Well, technically, yes. But essentially, no, I would say. So it really depends on these technical aspects. And so in this article, I wanted to make things clear and give this separation between people that really vouch for extinction and people that just are inspired by this idea that we don't have to just blindly reproduce. We can make our own choices. We have reproductive freedom. and therefore they just think it's an attractive idea that could definitely be of benefit to us. But so yeah, I do think there's a clear distinction. I don't think everybody is equally anti-natalist who claims to be anti-natalist.
Oh, I definitely agree with you there. I mean, I keep I run the widest tent in the antinatal circus. Like, I like to keep the definition wide, partially because I think it's part of the way forward. Like, if this idea has any hope, then you kind of have to embrace different forms of anti-procreation, because it's a very rare sentiment. Like, it's just it's an oppressed one, in many parts of the world. And so I do it for those reasons. But of course I agree with you that, it's only extinctionist antinatalism that's real antinatalism. I would definitely agree with you. But I think that you do find that in some of these more sort of proto NGOs. I mean, Child Free India, for instance, I mean, they sort of run the gamut of all forms of antinatalism. Some of it's more, again, on the child-free spectrum, but then some of it's more on the extinctionist side of things. Anti-natalism International, though it exists in sort of diminished form at the minute, is an organization that I put together with a number of friends of mine. It's quite extinctionist. So I think that's in there, and I just think that it might be valuable to make a bit of a distinction between groups like that and people who hate disabled babies on Reddit. You know what I mean? Like, that's not that's not antinatalist activism.
No. There's a lot of trolls on Reddit, of course.
A lot
of people just think it's cool to be antinatalist now. I just, for many people who are self-professed antinatalists, the people that I would call activistic antinatalists, they're just caught up in this wave of childlessness that's mostly sweeping wealthy places, right? So it's not just the West, it's also Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China in its entirety almost. Cities like Mumbai in India, people are not reproducing as much as they used to. And antinatalism cleverly ties into this sort of phenomenon that we have, this association between wealth, education, and sort of reproduction. So that many people are inspired by this, and they sort of think it's cool, like, yeah, there's some sense to it. And then they sort of use this antinatalist philosophy to identify themselves. So of course, I'm not speaking about all these organizations, but that's the idea that I have with many self-professed antinatalists online, on Reddit, on Facebook, possibly on Instagram, Snapchat. I can't keep up with it anymore. But many people there is a phenomenon in society now that people just don't have kids for a variety of reasons. And only maybe 0.5% of the people who would call themselves antinatalists, I estimate, would actually be like hardcore extinctionist antinatalists. Right. And the rest just don't want to have kids, right? So it's and it's always a question of like orthodoxy, right? Some people, if you look at religion, there's always going to be some hardliners who say, no, you have to really follow scripture. And there's going to be people who say, well, I just like to go to church once every month, or I just like to have coffee with the ladies from church after the service. You can't really say that they're not religious, they're not, obedient to scripture, but it's a bit of a different ballgame. So I guess in this debate, I would be a bit of a hardliner, perhaps, in the sense that I only recognize like the beliefs of this like 0.5% of antinatalists to be legit. But yeah, I think that it's not necessarily a bad thing when it comes to pretty extreme positions like extinction, that we sort of close the gate for many people.
Yeah. Now, just to clarify, like the other side of it, the people that are not full extinctionist antinatalists, your idea is perhaps this is coming out of like affluence, like that's part of what's inspiring them to sort of be more on the child-free spectrum.
Possibly,
okay. Yeah.
So it's like I'm not bashing these people. I'm not saying that they're inauthentic or illegitimate. I'm just saying, like, we need to establish different boundaries. There's certain antinatalists that are philosophical, certain ones that are not. Both are, of course, against birth, and therefore they are antinatalist technically. But there's probably more than 50 shades of antinatalist in the world today.
For sure. I couldn't disagree with you there.
Cool.
But there's at least some reasons, I think, why these divides are happening. I think there's really several factors at play here. One, again, we talked a little bit about this already. It's the incredible controversial nature of being open about pro-extinction. I mean, I think that does keep a lot of antinatalists silent. They are afraid. And I mean, we have a lot of antinatalists in all kinds of really dangerous situations. I mean, Lawrence Anton, a fellow antinatalist buddy of mine, I mean, he just interviewed an antinatalist in, I think, where was it? Algeria or something like, I mean,
Okay.
really like, a dangerous situation. I mean, a situation where they could be killed,
Yep.
if ideas like this came out, especially since, a lot of antinatalism is associated with atheism. So there's all this, but there's also, I mean, there's no, the other reason is that I think, on the philosopher side of the equation, there haven't really been all that many who've been willing to be public figures. Of the three that created the core philanthropic arguments, David Benatar never shows his face. And while I don't for a second question, that he's why he does that, I mean, I think it does help to reinforce this sense of fear about philosophical antinatalism and being public about it. And then there's Shauna Schifrin, the inventor of the consent argument. She also is pretty anonymous, and I don't even know if identifies as an antinatalist philosopher, but she doesn't show her face. Then there's the only one that does is Matti Hairi. He invented the risk argument. He does show his face, but despite that fact, he's not. He as a contributor to antinatalism, most antinatalists didn't really know about him until about a year ago, unfortunately. So there's no leadership, there's no infrastructure, there's been very little collaboration up until fairly recently between the philosophers and the activists. So I think that that's one reason why there is this divide, and I'm curious what you think about that.
So first of all, I'd like to say that one of the most interesting things I've ever heard about anti-natism, I was talking about this recently with somebody, and he claimed that he had proof that David Benatar does not exist. So it's just, I don't know what exactly he thinks, but there's either a group of people who just push forward this David Benatar image or something, this sort of straw figure, or he claims that there's some sort of corporation behind this. I don't know, but he just claims that Benatar does not exist. I understand why he thinks this. I like to believe that he does exist, but it is weird how he doesn't show himself. And there is a clear lack of leadership in his movement. I don't see it as a bad thing. Only when you're interested in sort of the local temporary aspect or the potential of anti-natalism, then leadership would be good. But I think I don't see why lack of leadership in at least on the philosophical side of things, why there would have to be a problem. So when you clearly want to inspire a community to not have kids for, say, 50 years, then leadership would be necessary. But when you just think about ideas, around extinction, destroying humankind, basically, I don't think there has to be clear leadership. So can I ask you why you think it's a bad thing that there's no face of the movement?
Well, I think because there is a tremendous amount of good that this idea can do. I mean, there's a long way to go before we got to really worry about extinction happening. I mean, in the meantime, there's a lot of suffering in the world. There's a lot of people being produced there's a lot of need being produced for no need. And it's antinatalism is essentially, 100 years or more behind something like the vegan movement. And I think it could be just the same. I think it could, and there's a huge relationship between the vegan movement and the anti-natalist movement, and there's a clear scaling up of what this at the activist side of the movement could be. And I think that one thing that it needs is people that are willing to be faces of the movement, so that it can alleviate some of the fear involved. I think anti-natalism does have the possibility of being a real activist movement in the world. I mean, again, I think we can do a lot to prevent birth, and I think that's something that is a very good initiative, and I think it's something that's crying out to be developed further. And I think that having more public facing anti-natalist philosophers is one thing that could help that. I think having more collaboration between anti-natalist philosophers and anti-natalist activists can solidify what this thing is in the world in a more pronounced way. I think there's a lot of real positive things that antinatalism can bring to the world, but it can't do that if it doesn't have that infrastructure.
Right. So do you, for instance, think that suppose there's an NGO that operates in like a developing country and that sort of hands out free anti-conception to people there, right? So they make 1 million condoms every month and they just ship them out to this country and just spread them out. And then the reproduction numbers will go down inevitably. Would you say that that's an anti-natalist organization, this NGO?
No, I mean, I think that's part of what an antinatalist NGO could do. I think part of what an antinatalist NGO also needs to do is make arguments towards, end goals like extinction and things like that. But I think it's also, I think that there are relationships that can be built between antinatalist organizations. And I think that there's things like the right to die, things like veganism. I think antinatalism is a bit of a missing piece to those discussions. And I think that there's all kinds of sort of collaborations and inroads that can be made between these different ideas. So yes, I mean, again, I think that an antinatalist organization can directly influence reproduction, in terms of like handing out contraception, like you're saying. I don't think it ends there. I mean, I think that, and again, I think these are part of what you're saying is, things that need to be developed. I mean, what does antinatalist activism that is effective really look like in the world? I mean, an organization like Stop Having Kids, which is just about to become a full NGO, I think, if I'm not mistaken, right. Their mode of activism right now has been a lot of street activism. So they're out there holding signs, they have like billboards and stuff. I mean, that's one form of engaging with the public with antinatalist ideas. But I think that there's more things that we could be out there doing.
Right. So you do think that every individual, every sort of worldview, every organization, NGO, that sort of combats this almost holy taboo that there is on questioning reproduction, you think that would all justifiably be referred to as anti-natalist?
No, I don't. I not necessarily. I mean, I think that an organization like Project Prevention, okay, that does abortions and contraception and stuff to drug addicts, I would not call that an antinatalist organization. They might be doing things that, well, first of all, there's no the consciousness of antinatalism is not out there yet. So if it were to be, it's possible that an organization like that could find an antinatalist identity, but I wouldn't say that those types of organizations are antinatalist. But I think that part of what an organization like that is doing is part of what a more consciously active antinatalist organization would do.
So you clearly seem to agree that there's some sort of elusive, abstract sense of antinatalism, like the true antinatalism, and a more practical, hands-down sort of manifestation of this, or like a group that puts this into practice, say.
Yeah, and I don't think that they have to be separate. I mean, I think that's
right,
there's a unity between what you're identifying as these disparate forms that is just it's basically what you're identifying as something very young. That is, antinatalism is basically in its infancy as a form of activism and as a form of philosophy too. I mean, it's
sure.
It's only since 2006 that it's developed tremendously since then. But I mean, at the minute, as a whole, it doesn't really know whether it wants to be just a depressed and angry child, or whether it's going to grow up into something more. And again, the specter of the extinction side is a long way the hell away. What does that middle ground look like? I think it can incorporate all of these things like you're bringing up, like, yes, like passing out contraception and those kinds of things. But obviously, I think it's something to be further developed, and I think it can, again, be a very positive force in the world. The main problem that any self-professed antinatalist will run into is the great bias against their newfound conviction. Life is simply geared towards its own perpetuation, not its cessation. People are more or less programmed to reproduce. So obviously I agree with you. Tons of pushback to be found, but I don't really necessarily agree with the idea that we are programmed to reproduce. I mean, reproducing creatures are propelled by a desire to have sex. And I would agree that procreation is, my idea is that procreation is mostly a cultural phenomenon, a very strong one. Granted, it's but not the driving power of programming. What would you say to that idea?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I do think we're programmed. And of course, when I say programmed, people easily think that we're programmed by somebody to reproduce. I don't think that's necessarily the case. But I do think we're just geared towards reproducing. And like, yeah, there's this cultural aspect where reproduction, or the lack of reproduction even nowadays, is sort of valued a lot. But I don't think it's purely cultural, because why do mice reproduce? There's no, unless you think that there's like a mouse, I don't know, patriarchy or something. I think we just reproduce like all other animals.
Well, no, I certainly don't think there's a mouse patriarchy. I mean, I think that animals are more natural creatures than we are, in the sense that they haven't developed culture in the way that we do, and so I mean, I just think that the same kind of programming has been a bit severed, because we have developed culture, and so it's more of a, I think it's more propelled by a sexual drive than.
Yeah,
I mean, I
guess
animals,
what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly animals. I mean, they don't have a choice in the matter. I mean, they're yeah. So I guess that's.
No, I understand what you're saying. Like, there is definitely a clear cultural component here, because we've left the innocence of the animal kingdom a long time ago. I mean, we built weapons of mass destruction, skyscrapers, proton accelerators or neutron accelerators, whatever. So we've left that realm behind us quite a long time ago. At the same time, there's still this sort of, I don't know, basic animal DNA in us that we can never get rid of. So maybe I have a very simplistic view of what humans are. I don't know. But I definitely understand that, yeah, there is this cultural component too. But I don't think reproduction is completely artificial for us. I don't think there's no natural part of us, and we're complete cultural creatures. We're completely conditioned by society and nothing else. I do think there's a big sort of natural element to us as well.
For sure. I guess what I would say is, I think that the natural part that comes through here is the sexual drive. That it's sort of the it's the tool that the DNA uses to compel us to do its bidding. But yeah, no, thank you for your thoughts on that. So I mean, before we go to the next paper, which I can't wait to get into. I'm just curious what kind of reactions these first two papers have received. I mean, have you noticed much discussion of them amongst antinatalists? What's been sort of the response, in your academic circles? Especially insofar as what the things that you say about antinatalist activism. I mean, I just really am curious what reactions you've received to all that.
Right. So I wish I could tell you that I know people just love my work, but the sad reality is people don't really care. So I have not.
I am sorry to hear that.
Responses to this. I'm still working on this. Maybe someday. So far, the reaction has not been that, let's say, explosive. And of course, secretly, we're not willing to admit it. But anyone who's like active in the academic world, who's a philosopher, who's publishing, would like to have an explosive response to their work. But of course, I understand that's not always happening, and it's certainly not always happening right away. So I'm proud of my work. That's the most important thing for me. So
100%. Well, I hope the reactions to your work increase, certainly. If you don't mind me asking, and again, like, if this is area that is not good for us to get into, just we can cut this out. But I'm always curious, sort of, what it's like to attempt to publish work on this subject. I mean, have you had any sort of difficulty, like, getting people to accept that this is a topic of discussion? I mean, have you had much pushback to? Because it's really quite impressive. I mean, you really published quite a lot on this subject, as I mentioned earlier in this interview. I mean, 6 papers on the subject of antinatalism is a really great offering to the idea.
Yeah.
But I mean, is it difficult to publish on the subject of antinatalism?
Well, what I find, interestingly enough, and you must experience this the same way. You're working on antinatalism for a long time, like, it really consumes you. So you think that it's a very big thing in the world and everybody's talking about it, but that's not the case. Like I've been working on this so long. I just assume that everybody knows about it. But most often, what happens most often when I try to publish on this or try to give a talk on this at a conference, people don't know it's a thing. They're like, multiple people have asked me if I'm the one who came up with this term anti-natalism. I'm like, no, it's been around. I'm just talking about this, but people they're confused. They're like, what the hell is this stuff? And that's not what I was expecting, but I guess it's changing slowly. Like anti-natalism is becoming better well-known or more well-known than it used to be. But yeah, the initial response was pretty cold, I would say.
That's fascinating. Yes, I also have received that same reaction. Like,
okay.
So you came up with this? Like, this is your idea? It's like, no.
I wish.
Exactly. I wish.
Yeah.
But no. Thank you for your insight into that. I find that absolutely fascinating. I mean, have you had much? So the reaction has been mostly cold, but I mean, not negative. Would you say?
No, I don't think so. And that's probably because, like I said, like I'm a non-practicing anti-natalist, so people don't. I think when you're really like vouching for like, hey, you cannot reproduce, it's too bad, I think people will give you a bit of a negative response to that. In my case, I've not experienced any negative side effects of writing about these things at all. I mean, maybe people are like really angry at me for writing the things I did, but I've not heard about it. So
okay, interesting. Yeah, that's
I hope we can keep it this way as well. But yeah, like I said, I think if you have a more activist approach to this, like you also open the door to a lot of criticism.
Oh yeah.
Then it becomes sort of a sentimental, emotional thing. But when you just work with this philosophically, people don't really care.
Yeah, no, thank you for your insight into that. I mean, my graduate thesis was all about antinatalism, and obviously I took it from a more activist angle and a weird art angle at Taboo.
Okay.
I only actually ever had one really angry response, which is interesting.
Right.
It's like I think because it's such a rare idea.
Yeah.
People generally kind of like there's a certain level of fascination. People, kind of. I wonder if your experience has been sort of the same on that front. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess people secretly are fascinated by stuff that's dark. They secretly like dark art and dark movies, dark music, dark books. I don't know where this fascination comes from, but maybe it reminds us of something of our childhood or something. So there is this sort of grim fascination with topics like extinction and that kind of thing. But can I ask you who was the negative response by? Like who was that person who responded angrily to your work?
I truthfully don't remember their name. It was like a first year my school, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, had like their first year program. It was one of those professors. I've only met him once, and it was sort of so I made a movie called The Ethicist, and it was like an very early edit of some material from that. And I mean, and it was really benign material, I have to say. There was really nothing in there that was at all pro-mortalist or anything, but he just went nuts. I mean, he just started making accusations like, you're gonna poison the drinking water and all this stuff, and then wouldn't stay in the room, like, it was like, like just pacing like a mad tiger, like in front of the door for the entire length of the critique. So it was really I mean, it's terrible, you never want that in a end of the year review kind of situation, but it was fascinating.
Yeah. No, I mean, I guess when it's like your graduate thesis or graduate work, then you don't want this response, but I would love to have some response like that, just to really just wind people up. Would probably make me feel like Socrates a little bit, but I don't know if you experienced it like that as well, but
it was terrible at the time. I'm kind of proud of it now. I mean, look, it's way better than people being bored, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So that's but that's interesting to hear. I'm sure like David Benatar obviously gets a lot of like negative responses, but I've yet to receive them.
Yeah, well, I'm glad for that. I'm glad you haven't had that experience. So I'd love to now move on to your third paper, a sonogram on the dark side of the Tao, the possibility of antinatalism and Daoism. Truly, Robbert, one of the most, I can say this without a shred of insincerity, one of the most unique papers on the subject of antinatalism I have ever read. I do not think any other paper has really tackled like
convergence between these two ideas at all. So a true congratulations to you on that. I think it really is a stunning piece. Yes, absolutely. So I truthfully have not really written many questions about this paper, only because I really was just hoping you could explain your ideas. I just love to hear you talk about that. I'm so long as it's all right with you, I am gonna read the abstract, but then please just say whatever you wish to about it.
Yeah, sure, of course. Go for it.
Wonderful. Okay.
Abstract. In the present work, I study Taoist philosophy in conjunction with the radical new philosophy of antinatalism, spearheaded by South African philosopher David Benatar. Although I am not claiming equivalence between the two, a meaningful communication emerges between the classical Chinese sources used here and the modern doctrine of antinatalism. I argue that both visions partake in a radical critique of consciousness, according to which faculty of the human mind is far from what it is often held to be. In fact, it is perceived as a destructive and disruptive element of and in existence. Moreover, both offer a praxis of return that seeks to undo this disruption. In the case of Daoism, consciousness pushes humans ever farther away from the Tao. It is imperative to return from this exile and to return to the Tao. This can, radically, only be achieved by the return from ordinary conscious existence. This is the prerogative of sagehood. It will be shown that the trajectory of sagehood shares important parameters with the antinatalist quest to signify, and perhaps conclusively, challenge human hubris in the cosmos at large, and to reinstate cosmic humility.
So, absolutely fascinating. So, yeah, I'd love to hear anything you wish to say about this.
So, yeah, first of all, thank you for your kind words about this paper. What I really tried to accomplish in this paper is to make a case for this disconnection between antinatalism and reproduction. And I did this using some seminal texts from the Taoist corpus. So it's not really a comparative philosophical work where I say, look, we have this in Taoism, we have this in antinatalism, and they're the same. What I think is most important about both of these views is that they share this sort of not so congratulatory view on human existence, right? So this is really what they do have in common in both Taoism and antinatalism. We see that human existence is a bit of an obstacle. The world works just fine without us. Most of our achievements can be seen as incredibly hubristic and greatly damaging to the world around us. So the most important thing is not that both Taoism and antinatalism somehow share this project of stopping reproduction forever. That only comes into play later on. But they do share this grim diagnosis that human life is, first of all, suffering, and it would be better if we didn't exist. So this very abstract idea that we're some sort of mistake, it would have been better if we never came into existence. That is something you see in both of these traditions. And that's what I really zoomed in on when I tried to make this case. That it's not all about reproduction. It's really about this sort of grim view. And then what comes around the corner next is probably the emphasis on extinction. That we have to sort of rectify the mistakes that we've inadvertently made by existing, getting rid of us, in other words, sort of alleviating this pressure that we exert on the world around us. That for me is what antinatalism is all about. And one possible way of achieving this is by gently persuading people not to have kids. Now that's not something you will find in Taoism, but the other parts, where humankind is not really viewed as a great asset in the world, that's something that you also find in antinatalism, of course. So I hope that makes sense when I talk about it like this. But I really try to continue to work my first two papers and really continue this process of identifying what antinatalism is about. Sort of contribute to the ongoing process of defining antinatalism by disconnecting antinatalism from the sort of the emphasis on reproduction, on childbirth.
Right. Okay. Disconnecting it from the focus on childbirth, more focusing it on extinction, essentially. If I'm understanding correctly,
or like on pessimism, maybe we can call pessimism. So that to me is more important than just not having kids.
Right. Okay. And that sort of that Taoism sort of recommends sort of the same sort of solution, but not in terms of reproduction.
Yeah. So what Taoism recommends, and Taoist texts are clear that this is not easy. Like, it's not within reach. Like, it's not necessarily going to happen to all of us anytime soon. But they do clearly preach or they advise us to sort of rectify the mistakes that we've made as a species and sort of undo the unnecessary pressures of our existence on the world around us. Antinatalism is way more practical, it's way more contemporary, of course. So they make this claim that, hey, we can actually achieve this by not reproducing. We don't find that in Daoism, but we do find this, this sort of approach to lessen the pressure on the world around us. And also one last thing. So like sagehood is often the term used to refer to this sort of, undoing the damage that humans have done, that our consciousness has done. Now, there's not a whole lot of talk about what a sage would actually look like. It's a bit of a sort of an abstract category. But I do think that it's going to be very difficult to rhyme sagehood with reproduction. So undoubtedly, when you're actually a Taoist sage, you're participating, you're returning to sort of the thing before humankind. I don't see how you can have kids in that sort of atmosphere. So that's sort of a side effect of comparing these two things. It's not the most important thing, but at the same time, yeah, you can sort of see how Orthodox Taoists would probably not recommend having a whole lot of kids either.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point. I could definitely see that as well. In antinatalist online circles, I believe that this is the paper of yours that I've seen discussed the most.
Yeah, that's true, actually. Yeah.
And I mean, and it's been very positive from what I've seen. I mean, just because if for no other reason that I think people there's just been no research into that kind of connection before. I mean, certainly there's been a lot of research into sort of the more Christian antinatalism side, but comparing it to different, world philosophies or world religions, I mean, it's very, very, very rare. But one thing I have not seen is sort of like, has there been any reaction from people who are Taoists? I mean, have you gotten any feedback from?
I have not received any feedback from that corner, but I was only recently notified that some people were discussing this paper on Reddit. I've not really read the discussion, but I mean, of course, it's wonderful that people are discussing this. If they have any questions, holler at me. I'd be glad to return emails to talk to people about this. I've not had any Taoists or people who work on Taoist philosophy reach out to me. Maybe in the future. I mean, my door is always open.
What I absolutely hope that happens. I mean, I think this really does deserve a lot of much further inquiry, and I hope that not only antinatalists, I hope that you not only receive that from antinatalists, but also from the Taoist community. I think that would be really, really fascinating. Incidentally, and I'm sorry this is a little bit tangentially related to the paper, but as somebody who has spent you've spent quite a lot of time in China, and that's been a huge aspect of your life and your work. I was wondering if you had any opinion on how antinatalism is perceived in China, and if you've met, Chinese antinatalists, or because I do know of some, and there have been some Chinese antinatalist communities online, although it's a bit kind of hush hush, and it's kind of an interesting circumstance. Do you have any insight into that?
So when it comes to antinatalism in Asia, I do know some Japanese antinatalists. To my knowledge, antinatalist philosophy, say the work of Benatar, is not really well known in China. But obviously the things it talks about do ring a bell, because China is facing a demographic nightmare right now, brought about by a bunch of factors. So I'm not really aware of any organized antinatalist groups there. I know some people there who find it interesting. I do feel, I think I'm justified in saying that it plays a bigger role in other countries than in Chinese philosophical circles right now. So,
of Asian countries, I think you're correct that Japan is the one that has adopted an interest in it the most. And
probably that's probably true. Yeah.
All right, interesting. Thank you so much. I really. Is there anything else you'd like to say about this particular paper before?
No. I think we covered most of the topics in the paper. So yeah, thanks for the questions.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. Moving on to the next one, Unfeigning the Delusion, Antinatalism and the End of Suffering.
Abstract. In this article, I explore the antinatalist view according to which it would be better if humans were to stop reproducing in order to contribute to the nonviolent and voluntary extinction of the species as a whole.
Not only is reproduction morally problematic in an already vastly overpopulated world, it is held that the human predicament can only be solved by slowly but surely removing human presence altogether. Radical as this might sound, it must be noted that, far from the villainous distaste of human life and happiness, this view emerges from a careful consideration of the vicissitudes of ordinary human existence. In spite of innumerous earlier attempts, suffering cannot be blotted out in life. What is called for, then, is something more conclusive. We can only remove suffering when we get rid of that which suffers. Any other attempt at solving the human predicament ultimately represents a mere cosmetic approach to problem solving and the eradication of suffering.
I apologize. This one just sort of slipped past me a bit.
No
Is there
problem.
anything you would like to say about this particular one?
Yeah, so this paper, I really continue my line of inquiry from the South African paper, the Wailing from the Heights of Velleity. Again, I disconnect antinatalism from the sort of the emphasis on reproduction, on childbirth. And I, again, argue for the following. If you want to be consistent, if you want to be like a true antinatalist, you have to adopt this sort of philosophical, originary perspective, and you cannot be an activist antinatalist. If you really want to eradicate suffering, you can try all sorts of things. You can stand on your head for a couple of days. It's not going to fix the problem of suffering. Only when we adopt this really strict, sort of objective, morally absolute, originary, philosophical antinatalist perspective can we actually eradicate suffering by sort of contributing to our own slow but steady extinction. And ultimately, that's what antinatalism is about. If you read Benatar, it's all about getting rid of suffering. And so again, I'm trying to highlight this, sort of contribute to the debates in this way. So I think it's also the shortest paper, but I do think it's sufficiently dense that these ideas are sort of all there.
Yes, 100%. And we talked a little bit about this previously. There's antinatalism as it applies to humanity. We talked a little bit about sentiocentric antinatalism. What are your thoughts on, because I think you do briefly mention this in this paper, like what are your thoughts on antinatalism extending towards an opposition to the creation of sentient machines, like anti-AI natalism? Do you think that would be, what are your thoughts on that being a form of antinatalism or concern for antinatalists? Yeah.
So I find this very interesting. I do share Professor Benatar's idea that he talks about briefly, that if we do develop actually conscious AI, we're going to have the same problems that we have, right? So even these machines with consciousness are going to suffer, right? That's just a side effect of or another side of the conscious coin. So you cannot be conscious and not suffer. And Benatar, unfortunately, doesn't spend too much time on discussing this, unless he came out with a paper on this in the last couple of weeks, and I haven't read it. But yeah, I do think that you can only impossibly not suffer when you have some sort of consciousness.
I would agree with that. Yeah. Have you, just out of curiosity, have you read, because as far as I know, Benatar has not gone further with that particular idea in his own work, but there are others that have, particularly Thomas Metzinger, somebody named Bartek Szymanski. So, do you feel that that's sort of an emergent form of antinatalism?
Absolutely. I think AI everywhere is just exploding right now. So like AI art, AI, all sorts of AI is really hot right now. So I think studying AI and antinatalism in tandem is sort of the next way forward. That's super fascinating.
I 100% agree. 100% agree. So the next paper I want to talk about is Morality's Collapse, Anti-natalism, Transhumanism, and the Future of Mankind. I will briefly read the abstract.
Abstract. In the present work, I explore the unignorably momentous responsibility of contemporary philosophy to conclude the project of humanism as inherited from Enlightenment-era thinking. I argue that there are presently two avenues open to us. On the one hand, there is anti-natalism, according to which humankind must be gestured towards self-imposed extinction and thereby overcome. On the other hand, there is transhumanism, which inspires the hope that we may transcend any limitation of our being and flourish as a result of radical enhancement, thereby also overcoming humankind. On both accounts, the human is something to be overcome, either negatively, anti-natalism, or positively, transhumanism. As both have a common ancestor in radical Enlightenment-era humanism, This choice between radical resignation and affirmation becomes all the more pertinent now that we find ourselves in modernity's wake and in the ruins of morality's collapse. When you say conclude the project of humanism as inherited by Enlightenment era thinking, do you mean that the ideas of antinatalism and transhumanism have to be defeated to such an extent that something else emerges, or that humanity may be tasked with having to settle for one of these two extremes?
Right. So that's a very good question. I find it hard to believe that anything comes after this. Like, for me, this sort of conflict between anti-natalism, transhumanism is the end of philosophy. I think philosophy, has been going on for, let's just say for the sake of convenience, 2,500 years. I think every development within philosophy over the past 2,500 years or so now points in this direction. Like, everything was just a preparation for this to emerge. And I think this is sort of there's three main reasons that I find antinatalism interesting. First of all, it's the sort of the connection with Schopenhauer. And secondly, what we talked about is sort of how it ties into societal, civilizational processes, like this people having more autonomy in their choices to reproduce or not. And then thirdly is how it interacts with transhumanism. I think in many senses, transhumanism and antinatalism are each other's opposite. At the same time, they're united because both of them try to sort of overcome the human as it is known. They both try to sort of cross the boundaries of traditional humankind, and they do so in opposite directions. So anti-natalism is trying to get rid of the human, and transhumanism is trying to streamline human existence, make it better, make it faster, make it stronger, all these things. So I think it's fascinating. I don't think we have to settle for either of them. I don't think they're that big in society. Obviously, the fact that Elon Musk is investing billions into transhumanist projects means that transhumanism is already winning. It's not really a fair battle. But I don't think it's really going to envelop society as a whole. I think as a philosopher, this sort of conflict, this contrast between these two movements is extremely fascinating. And I'm actually surprised and a little bit annoyed that not more people are sort of researching this sort of waltz of overcoming the human. So, yeah.
Oh, I 100% agree with you on that last point, and also that I mean, where does it go from here? I mean, those really I think are the last two stops. So the idea that this is sort of the end of philosophy, I don't see how it couldn't be. I agree with you 100% on that. We'll get to kind of an interesting confluence between transhumanism and antinatalism in a second. But one other quote from the paper: while fantasies of human extinction cannot but result from a type of evolutionary mutation, since it counters the very thing that evolution is programmed to achieve, they are strangely seeping into the mainstream. So just a little bit more. I mean, do you believe that? I mean, am I understanding this correctly, that you think that antinatalism is a kind of genetic or evolutionary mutation? I guess we'll move on to the confluence between antinatalism and transhumanism right now. I mean, incidentally, this is not dissimilar to what David Pearce seems to believe. David Pearce, is a transhumanist antinatalist, and he believes that he calls himself a soft antinatalist, and he does that because he doesn't believe that antinatalism can win. And the reason why he doesn't think that antinatalism can win is because of what he calls selection pressures. So basically, the idea is that philosophy is genetic, and if antinatalists don't reproduce, then they won't genetically perpetuate antinatalism into the future, and that will only strengthen the natalist genetic programming. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and whether you agree with that.
No, that's fascinating. So I don't think there could be like a genetic mistake that makes us all anti-natalist. But at the same time, what we talked about before, like, we've left traditional nature far behind us, right? We make weapons of mass destruction, telescopes, space jets, all sort of things. So it's very clear that we're not really a natural species anymore. And that's also why we can choose to be anti-natalist now. I think everything has led up to this sort of finale right now, where we see anti-natalism and transhumanism sort of take over the torch from earlier philosophies. And this is really endgame material right here, I would say. So I don't know what comes after. I just think, the time is now ripe to really look at these movements in unison. And this could not have emerged at any earlier time. So I think now we can fully, finally transcend our traditional role as being a part of this animal kingdom, and sort of take it to its extreme and say, well, how we've always been, we don't like this anymore. We want to be something else, or we don't want to be at all. So, and again, that plays into like what, other more large scale processes where people can now finally criticize this sort of taken for granted decision to have kids, right? Before, people would just have 10 kids and not think about it. And now you can say, well, I don't want to have 10 kids. Maybe I just want to have 1 or 2 or none at all. So that all sort of relates to each other. And I find that super fascinating.
Oh, 100%, 100%. I mean, going back to Pierce briefly, what do you think of the idea of that an anti-natalist could be both anti-natalist and transhumanist? Do you think that that's I mean, there is a lot of debate whether that's even really realistically possible. I mean, do you think that there's a possible middle ground between those two views?
I struggle with this as well, because I find transhumanism very interesting, but I would also call myself maybe like a non-practicing transhumanist. I don't have like a big laboratory here where I really try to calibrate my existence. I don't know. I find it difficult. I do think what unites transhumanism and anti-natalism is that they radically critique traditional human existence. So they both want to go beyond the human as we know the human. So that is interesting. That could, that leads me to believe that you can be a bit of both. But it's tough. I think we have to think long and hard about how this would be possible, because at the end of the day, transhumanism and anti-natalism are opposed to each other. They're two sides of this sort of neo-nihilist coin, because they both claim that human existence is insufficient, right? So we either have to make it better or just retire this whole thing and stop the show. So that's definitely something that unites these both views, but at the same time, they go in very different directions.
100%. Do you have an opinion on? I mean, do you think that one is more dangerous than the other?
Obviously, transhumanism is very dangerous. When we bring in, like, for me, anti-natalism is pretty harmless. People are always like lamenting how like whining about how dangerous this is, and it is radical, but it's not. I don't think it's dangerous per se. Transhumanism obviously is, because people are already investing hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars into this. So people are actually making a case for this. People are actually like building all sorts of facilities and doing experiments. And I think there's one harmless component of transhumanism, one that's more far-fetched and like earth-shattering. Because I do think when you take a bunch of supplements that like resveratrol, I don't know if you've heard of this. This is something I take every day as well. It's one of the sort of it's stuff that's in red wine, for instance. So you take the supplement, it's a good part of red wine. You don't get drunk. It doesn't increase your cholesterol or anything. That's a supplement that apparently is super helpful. And I do take this. So like, is that dangerous? Probably not. But then when you talk about like, I don't know, like cyborg humans and AI chips in our brains, that's obviously very dangerous.
I mean, I agree with you 100%. I mean, I can definitely see ways in which that antinatalism could become quite dangerous. But what it's not doing is proposing to play with, forms of suffering hitherto unknown. I mean, the failures of a transhumanist world are more terrifying to me than anything that an antinatalist world could possibly produce. And at the end of an antinatalist world, it does end. Like, I mean, there is a stopping point to the existence of suffering. Whereas it's refreshing to hear you say what you just have, because I feel like there's often a certain rosiness to the way people talk about transhumanism, where it couldn't possibly be a difficult path towards utopia. And I can't imagine that that's true. I just really feel like there's every possibility in the world that there's going to be a lot of suffering on the way to that betterment.
Right.
So
I think it's the funny thing is actually the failure of the Anti-natalist project is going to be harmless, right? Because no harm is literally going to be done, other than the harm already served, meaning that we suffer. But the failure of the transhumanist project is going to be a catastrophe. That's
exactly. I mean, we may end up in a far worse state
I mean, coincidentally, the failure of the transhumanist project might herald in the success of the anti-natalist movement. But it could lead to the destruction of us all, and then anti-natalism would have been successful. So that's also an interesting interaction between these movements, I suppose.
That's very possible.
And at the same time, if I can still add, a failure of the anti-natalist movement or project is also going to play into the hands of transhumanists, where they say, okay, no one is still vouching for our extinction. That means we have to go forward, go on, and just keep calibrating our traditional human existence.
And I think that's exactly, I hope I'm not misrepresenting his views, but I think that's sort of where David Pearce begins, that he's already sort of dubbed the whole thing a failure. He's said on multiple occasions, if he could press the red button, or be sort of if he believed that Benatarianism could win, that's the path that he would take. But he's taken the sort of transhumanist road instead, because
fair enough,
that's where it sort of left us. So interesting. Yeah. Thank you so much for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. So we have one more paper to talk about, and this is actually a book chapter that you were so very generous to share with me. Thank you so much. It is called Under Lion's Skin or Fox's Fur: Anti-natalism, Transhumanism, and the Emergence of 21st Century Neo-Nihilism. First off, is the neo-nihilism a reference to Koenig?
No, it's not. No, I don't know. No, it's just I like the term. It's not a specific reference to anyone's work.
Okay, I just was curious. So this is this is your newest contribution, and this is part of a book that is going to be called Technology, Users and Uses, Ethics and Human Interaction. Before I read the abstract and we talk a little bit about the paper, could you tell me something about the book project and how your paper fits into the bigger picture of that project? And just anything tell me about it.
Sure. No, so it's a very interesting book, and the people working on this, like the editors, are very nice people as well. So I started working on this probably about 1.5 2 years ago. It's going to be published sometime soon. So one of these days it's going to be it's going to hit the shelves. So I'm very proud to be a part of this work. So they look at technological challenges, obstacles, and how we respond to these without being super technical ourselves, right? So we're not really looking at sort of the perimeters of AI, like in how many years is it going to be successful. But what I did in this chapter sort of look at how this conflict between transhumanism and antinatalism plays out, with a particular emphasis on the emergence of AI. And again, I think we talked about some of these topics already. AI is also going to suffer. That's fair enough. But it does sort of indicate that transhumanism is a bit more dangerous. And there's a bit more at stake when we consider transhumanism as well. So that's
it's absolutely fascinating analysis, and I'm particularly interested in the addition of nihilism, neo-nihilism. That's something we haven't really discussed yet. We have addressed, I think, in fashion a lot of what was covered in this paper previously. But I'm curious about the addition of nihilism. I'm just curious in hearing more about how all of these different elements sort of fit together within that paper, if you'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So for me, neo-nihilism really continues earlier nihilist trends. I think what it boils down to nowadays, why it's neo-nihilism, is because people don't just criticize this or that aspect of human existence, but human existence in itself is quite severely critiqued, right? So what anti-natalism, transhumanism share is that both want to go beyond the human, either negatively in the case of anti-natalism or positively in the case of transhumanism, where they say, well, humankind is flawed, human existence is horrible, but we're going to make it better. And anti-natalism says, human life is horrible. We're a horrible species. We cannot make it better because we've tried and we've failed, and the only way forward is to lead to our own extinction. And then you get to all sorts of philosophical dilemmas, like could you have some sort of an AI world where people just live mentally or digitally and they don't have bodies to make them suffer? There's going to be all sorts of other different sufferings in that horrible world without bodies as well. So that's basically been sort of the angle I take in this work. But of course, at the moment, I'm doing much more research into this sort of connection between AI, transhumanism, anti-natalism. So it's still a work in progress, I'd say, because I'm still working on this and sort of sharpening my thoughts about this.
Brilliant. Well, I mean, that leads me to my next question. I mean, well, first off, again, congratulations on the new chapter of this book.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you.
Absolutely. So, I mean, what is next for you, Robert? What are you working on now, if I may ask?
Right. So hopefully at the end of this year, another book chapter is going to be published. This is going to be in a work on Chinese philosophy. So there I look at post-humanism, transhumanism, Daoism, the Lao Tzu, other works. So this is going to be possibly the chapter I'm most proud of. I'll send you a copy when it's all finished.
I would love that.
And I'm writing my first book, which is a novel. So it's called Immenses of Clamor. I try to just put in a lot of philosophical ideas that I'm playing with in literary form. So that's I do think it's easier to write literature than philosophy, obviously. It's harder to put your finger on like the sore spot and like what exactly is he saying here. But that's something I've been working on for the last 5 years. Hopefully next summer it's gonna be out. So I'll be sure to send you a copy of this one as well.
I would absolutely love that. Congratulations. That's extremely exciting. That's really cool. It's really cool to see you kind of making that switch from philosophy writing to some fiction. That's excellent. Do you believe that antinatalism will continue to be an important part of your work moving forward?
Oh, 100%. I'm not letting go now. So I think it's been with me for the past couple of years, and these years have been really formative for me in like creating my own philosophical identity. So I'm not going to leave this behind anytime soon. I'm constantly like reading new work about antinatalism. So I'm still very much, just active in this scene. And I don't foresee any change in this anytime soon, to be honest. So, yeah. I
love hearing that. I ultimately, I don't care if somebody is anti-antinatalist, if they're antinatalist, if they're a non-practicing antinatalist. It's the passion for the subject that I like to see, no matter sort of where you fall on that spectrum. So that's so exciting. I'm so excited to see where your work on the subject takes you. That's great. And I'll definitely be reading along and following. How can our audience best support the works that you've done? I mean, are there places online that people can find you and follow your work? How can people keep up?
I mean, first and foremost, they can find me on academia.edu. I think that's a bit of an easy way to find me. The best way people can support my work is to criticize it. Just unleash hell on my work. That would be the best acknowledgement, the best recognition I can imagine. So just tear my work apart and just write the nastiest things about me. That's I'll be a happy man.
Well, I hope that people will be kinder than that. But hopefully after watching this, people, I know there's so much more we could have delved into. Like I said, there's so much in your work that deserves far greater exploration and detailed discussion. But I hope that today has served as a bit of an overview of the work that you've done on the subject, and I hope that people will be inspired to contact you and to read your papers and to give you some feedback. So, Robert, thank you so much for being my guest today on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to finally meet you and speak to you about the work that you've done. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda. It's been lovely talking to you about this. Hope to stay in touch. I'll keep you updated about my new work, and I'll keep watching your podcast as well. If you have another guest that's sick at the last moment, you need somebody to replace him, let me know. Be happy to do this. But I hope we can continue our conversation about antinatalism, and hopefully see you next time.
See you next time for sure. I'd absolutely love that. Thank you so much, Robert.
Cool. All right, Amanda. Bye-bye. See you. Have a good day.
Yeah,
Cheers.
You as well, Robert. Take good care.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
All right.
Thank you for listening to the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. Please follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Exploring Antinatalism can also be heard on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Buzzsprout, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Amazon.com, and so many other platforms. You can email me at exploringantinatalism@gmail.com. Website designed by Visions Noirs. Please follow him at www.bionoir.com and follow him on Instagram. Logo art by Life Sucks. Please subscribe to him on YouTube and check out his shop on Etsy at www.etsy.com/shop/LifeSucksPublishing. Music by Mati Hairi. You can hear the whole song, Life is a Sexually Transmitted Disease with a Mortality Rate of 100%, by following the link in the description, and make sure to also read his academic paper which inspired the song, If You Must Give Them a Gift, Then Give Them the Gift of Non-Existence, in the Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics on cambridge.org. Links below. All the best, and bye for now.
compared to nil. Life is no thrill. It's worse than nil. So draw the right conclusion. Let them be still.